Blackstone. Hi, I'm Chuck Arning, National Park Service Ranger here in the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And today we're going to try to unravel the mystery of just who was the Reverend William Blackstone. One early historian suggests that Blackstone was merely a footnote to history. And yet, Blackstone was the founding settler of today's city of Boston, and he also was the first resident of what is now the state of Rhode Island. And that suggests a little bit more than a footnote. Still, other writers have characterized him as a hermit, as a recluse. Well, folks, I don't buy that. Just because a gentleman ventures out in the wilderness with merely his books, and most likely an indentured servant as his companion, that doesn't make him a hermit. Yet there are still many unanswered questions about just who was William Blackstone. So I tell you what, why don't you join me as we attempt to put some flesh and bones upon the good Reverend, and at the same time explore why National Park Service Rangers use interpretation as the key to telling the story of our heritage and our history. What is historical interpretation? As a ranger, I'm part of the interpretive division of the National Park Service, and it's our function to tell the story of the many sites within the National Park system in such a way so that you, the visitor, has your curiosity awakened, you feel a real connection to the story, and in some way you're provoked to learn more or explore more or even reflect a bit about the meaning of this particular story to you and your view of the world. And your view of the world is an important concept because that view of yours was shaped by the mores of our society, events that happened as you grew up, the values of your family, and important people in your life. And the world in the 1990s is vastly different than the world in England after the Protestant Reformation. The depth of belief, the religious thinking, and the fervor that drove the Puritans out of England, first to the Netherlands and then later to New England, is such that it's very difficult for our mindset here in the 1990s to really comprehend. And that's where the Ranger and his interpretation come in. We try to create that event in a time when it was happening, and we try to make that connection between that time and our world of today. No easy task. Now, I believe that Reverend Blackstone was a reflective man, a man who spent time considering the world around him, a world that was going through tremendous changes. And I'm betting that he would appreciate my Ranger colleagues as they commented on why and how they interpret history.
Every building, every ship, every resource that we have in this park is waiting to have its story told. And we have a lot of visitors who come here to the national parks wanting to hear those stories, wanting to know what meaning, why is this here? And as interpreters, it's our job to help to tell those stories so that visitors can form some sort of connection and perhaps find their own meaning in the resources that we have here. And in that way, maybe they'll want to preserve it for the future generations.
What I try to do here at Lowell National Historical Park is give each visitor that I talk to a sense of ownership of the resource. The National Park Service is the steward of these resources, and everybody that comes to this park should feel a sense of pride and ownership that Lowell National Historical Park is part of the national park system. One of the things that I read when I first came into the service was a quote by Stephen Mather, who said, "A man from Florida or Massachusetts has as much right to Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon as somebody from Wyoming or Arizona." And I kind of use that as a guiding philosophy when I talk to groups.
One of the first questions I ask myself before I begin each day as a frontline interpreter is, which hat am I going to wear? Ranger hat, mob cap, tricorn? Here at Minuteman, I believe the most important function of an interpretive ranger is to connect with the people, to bridge them to the past through images. Images who are people, colonists, who have a story to tell. Yes, I'm looking pretty funny to most people, but this costume represents the people and images back in 1775. It attracts the visitor.
I talk about the people that were involved so that they see, that it wasn't just, something built after the fact, that a struggle went on here. I try to tell them the story behind the struggle so that when they leave here, they remember. I learn more of the history to myself. For myself, it seems personal, and then I make it personal to the visitors. And that's like what, that motivates me to try to reach them the best way I can. The little ones, they want to, they want hands-on, lots of things, like that. So there you go again. To pique an interest so that they want to learn more. That's something else I want to do. I want them to learn more about the site and then more about the history behind it and everything.
What was the world like when William Blackstone came upon the scene? You see, to really appreciate and understand Blackstone, we have to visualize issues and conflicts of his day, for they shaped his opinions, his choices, and his actions. And indeed, the world of England was boiling with turmoil. With the development of Parliament to rule England, rather than a monarchy, it brought on a series of conflicts. The most significant of the many conflicts was one between the Catholics and the Protestants. Even today, we feel its impact. Witness the events in Northern Ireland. And yet, the arts and sciences were in full bloom. The Globe Theatre was performing the works of a William Shakespeare, and Sir Francis Bacon, a scientist-philosopher, was expanding his theories in the world of science. And yet it was the desire for religious freedom that was the crux of this turmoil. And into this world came William Blackstone. He was born, raised, and educated under the Anglican ministry. And in 1617, when he got his degree at Emmanuel College in Cambridge, King James I authorized the printing of the Bible in the language of the everyday English man and woman, the King James version of the Bible. Yet this man of God, this man of the Church of England, Blackstone, an ordained minister with a master's degree, signed up to leave England in 1623 as part of the Robert Gorges expedition to New England, landing in Wessagusset, now the town of Weymouth. Why? What was his motivation to leave England? Well, I've asked my good friend and Ranger colleague Kevin Kleiberg to join us and explain his interpretation, what motivated Blackstone to leave the privileged world of England and come here to the wilderness of the New World. Kevin, what do you think?
Well, Chuck, that's an excellent question, and unfortunately it's one that we don't have a very good answer for. But that's where our skills as interpreters really come into play. As interpreters, Chuck, we'd have to take into account all the different sources that we have on William Blackstone, both the contemporary accounts and also the more recent scholarly works. Then we try to factor in what we know about life here in early colonial America and also what was going on in England at that point. That time period, you have quite a number of people leaving England to come to America, so we have to ask ourselves, what were their reasons? One was people coming here to seek their fortune, or at least trying to better themselves, better their way of life. You also have all the people coming over here seeking religious freedom. Obviously, one of our best clues comes from William Blackstone's own statements, where he says he came to America to escape the Lord Bishops. We know that William Blackstone was an ordained Anglican minister, so from this we must take that he really felt he had to get away from the pressures of the hierarchy of the Anglican Church and probably the crown itself. So one of our best assumptions is that William Blackstone really came to America in order to find a place where he could have personal freedom. Another factor is we really must view William Blackstone as a prototype of the American pioneer. Although it's hard to view it like that today, Study Hill really was an outpost on the American frontier in the 1630s and 40s. So William Blackstone's desire to seek out a place in the wilderness that he could call his own, where he could live life the way that he wanted to, was really a key to his decision to come to America, and particularly to leave Boston and to come on down here to what's now the Blackstone Valley. And that same spirit that William Blackstone exhibited in the 1630s and 40s continued on through American history for the next 200 years or so as American settlers crossed the West and made it eventually to the Pacific Ocean.
Seems the Gorges expedition ran into some financial difficulty, but it wasn't necessarily due to Robert. It seems his father, Sir Ferdinand Gorges, who was also doing a rapid colonization of the Maine coast, couldn't finance two projects at the same time. So he basically told his son, come on home, and sold the original grant to John Winthrop and his associates. So Robert Gorges set sail back home to England, but not all of his expedition left with him. William Blackstone, one of four, struck out to the northwest toward the Shawmut Peninsula. Now, what does that tell us about the character of William Blackstone? For one thing, pegs him to be an adventurer. Despite the ecclesiastical collar that an ordained minister of the Church of England would wear in front of his congregation, Blackstone appeared to be a true wanderer, curious about what lay over the next ridge. He had an active mind, and as a man of letters, he most certainly would be aware of the writings of Sir Francis Bacon, a scientist and a philosopher, who was developing a radical theory on scientific experimentation. He died in 1626, 3 years after Blackstone left for the New World. It would appear that Blackstone, familiar with Bacon, had one eye towards the wonders of heaven and the other toward the wonders of nature. He was interested in plants, how they grew, what they could be used for. He developed into quite a horticulturalist. So we picture Blackstone, a man of great intellect, curious of new ideas and new ways, an adventurer, plodding across a new and strange land, a land that belonged to others. He was the stranger, and yet he was unafraid and anticipated the new wonders and discoveries. He came across the Shawmut Peninsula sometime in 1625 or 1626, a land that suited him well. Now, how do we know that? Well, by piecing together bits of information that has filtered down from that period, we can pinpoint when he first settled on what is today downtown Boston. For starters, we know he left Boston in 1635. An English traveler, a man named Letchford, who wrote about and published his adventures in 1641, speaks of one Master Blackstone, a minister who went from Boston having lived there 9 to 10 years, which would place him on the peninsula around that 1625 to 1626 time frame. Now, the Shawmut Peninsula was a perfect place for Blackstone. The water was good, with a spring not far from the spot. There was plenty of land bounded by the Charles River on one side and the bay on the other, giving him access to fish and shellfish. We begin to see here, during Blackstone's stay in Boston, some of the attributes that made him stand out as both an individual, an explorer, and a tamer of the wilderness. He planted both a garden and an orchard, and the only fruit we know for sure was in that orchard were apples.
Some people might consider interpretation to be just the passing of information from one person to another, but I think that a good interpreter must do much more than that. I think you want to make the material come alive in a sense, whether it's through the use of artifacts, of props, of an anecdote or any interesting story, or maybe even through costume. But no matter how you do it, you want to spark the visitor's interest so that he or she is ready and willing to gather more information, or to at least walk away with a better understanding and appreciation of your site.
People come to Minuteman and they really do want to be inspired. I think, people have a sense that America began here. This is where Americans first really fought, risked their lives for the right of self-government. And people come here knowing that, basically, and wanting to be inspired, wanting to feel proud of what happened here. Whether we're at Northbridge or on any part of the battlefield or at a historic house here where a family lived here who witnessed the battle. I try to get the people more focused on the place, that I'm just like the vehicle. So, and I think that's what national parks maybe are about, is that, because you can be in a classroom and study something in an abstract way. But people come to national parks, I believe, because they want to touch the real thing. They want to see the place. So I always try to keep in mind that that's what's important.
As an interpreter at the Adams National Historic Site, one of the first things that I keep in mind with every visitor who's coming through our gates is to try to put myself in their place. And I ask myself, why did this group of people or this individual choose to come to the Adams National Historic Site? This site is a very complex site which explores the history and development of the United States through one family's experience, 4 generations of Adams family, including 2 presidents and first ladies, writers, and historians. If the visitor wanted to find more information about the history and development of the United States, they could go to the library, they could visit many other places to explore that history and development, but they chose to come to the Adams National Historic Site. So one of the first things I do is appreciate that the visitor selected to come here. I'm hoping that people will walk away with a feeling, or at least an example, of one family who stood by their beliefs despite popular opinions. And even beyond that is an appreciation for the National Park Service and why this place is preserved among many.
We're here on the famous Boston Common, downtown Boston, but what's also known as the Shawmut Peninsula. And the year is 1997. You can probably tell that because we have lots of tourists here visiting Boston. And yet we're going to step back in time to 1630. And the Reverend William Blackstone's been here a good 5 years. The sails on the horizons indicate that he's going to have some company. And it's true. John Winthrop and his company of Puritans are going to land on the Charlestown side of the Charles River. And they've had a tough voyage. Lots of scurvy, so a lot of people are ill. On top of that, when they land in Charlestown, the border is bad. So more of the company comes down with illness. Now, they land in June of 1630, and if we picture the New England climate at that time of year, we realize that the black flies are probably just on their way out, but the mosquito system is really revving up. And those mosquitoes can be really vicious. So here we are. We're a Puritan in Winthrop's company. We're sick. We feel absolutely lousy. And yet we got to build shelter, cut wood, hunt, fish, start a garden, swat flies. Doesn't sound like a camping trip I'd be interested in. And so we get this picture of Winthrop and his Puritans really struggling to survive here in the New World. And we do have some historical evidence to support this picture. Winthrop kept a journal from 1630 to 1649 where he chronicled a lot of the events of his stay here in Boston. A lot of his entries tend to be very brief and sketchy in the early years. For example, in the summer of 1632, he wrote that the summer was wet and cold and caused great stores of mosquitoes and rattlesnakes. Now, it's hard to picture here in Boston on the Common there were rattlesnakes around here. So we get this picture of Winthrop and his Puritans struggling to survive. Now, picture this. We're on this side of Charles, not far from where I'm standing here. The Reverend William Blackstone is tending to his orchard and his garden. He's got high land up here with good visibility, and he's got good water. The Reverend's in good shape. It's easy to understand why one early writer on Blackstone wrote in 1896, his Tri-Mountain farm had been viewed with jealous eyes by the early comers to Charlestown. But Blackstone was a Christian, and he greeted the Winthrop party, offered them use of his land, and allowed him access to his water. Such action is not one of a hermit, but rather a man of compassion, aiding those struggling in the wilderness. The Puritans were very envious of Blackstone's holdings here. Winthrop went so far as to suggest that the land here was really part of his grant. But Blackstone, as one writer wrote, asserted in the most vigorous language that his claim to actual possession and settlement was his and his alone.
The king asserted sovereignty over this New England because John and Sebastian Cabot sailed along the coast without landing in any place. Well, if the quality of sovereignty can subsist upon the substratum of mere inspection, surely the quality of property can subsist upon actual occupancy, which is the foundation for my claim.
Sylvanus Newman, a newspaperman, sums it up best when he wrote in 1855 that Blackstone again bid adieu to the abodes of civilization and penetrated the gloomy forest in search of an asylum, preferring the untutored rudeness of the savage to the civilized bigotry and tolerance of the professed Christians.
What? I left England to get out from under the Lord Bishops, and here in America I'm fallen under the Lord Brethren. I look to have dwelt with my books and my orchards, my young fawn and bull in undisturbed solitude. Was there not enough room for all of ye? Could you not leave the hermit in his corner?
How did he view this new and wondrous world? As a scientist? A man of God? Certainly an adventurer. Perhaps as a Thoreau or Meriwether Lewis, or perhaps even a combination of those two explorers. Seeking good water, fertile land, an abundance of nature, a place where he would not be ruled by any man, a place where he could experiment with nature and follow the path that God had chosen for him. Now, one of the best-known stories about William Blackstone had to do with his ability to ride a bull. Story has it that he rode a bull from Boston down to Study Hill, which is probably 50 to 60 miles as a crow flies, and in those days it probably was a little longer. Now, in our modern day eye, we think of that as being fairly ridiculous, riding a bull. We think of that as probably one of the most dangerous rodeo events you can imagine, bull riding. And yet, if we go back to the 1600s, let's stop for a minute. Horses were fairly rare here in New England. Livestock was becoming more common. If a bull was conditioned properly from birth to be ridden, it is possible he might accept the rider. There are other accounts of New Englanders riding a bull. As a matter of fact, it's been said that it was Blackstone's main source of transportation. It was not uncommon for him to ride down to Providence to see Roger Williams on a bull, or even further south to Wickford, where he preached the first Episcopal sermon down in Wickford. And so we have this image of Blackstone, bag of apples slung over his shoulder, astride his bull, heading down to preach to Roger Williams and the congregation in Providence. Once again, controversy surrounds Reverend William Blackstone. This time, it has to do with the correct spelling of his name.
Well, one of the most common explanations on why William Blackstone used an X in his name is that there was no standardized spelling during the late 15, early 1600s with the English language, and that people spelled things the way that they sounded. That theory really doesn't hold that much water for me, because William Blackstone was a very educated man. He came from a landed gentry family, so he knew how to spell his name, and there were certain standardizations that he would have been very familiar with. What I think probably it was Blackstone was fluent in Greek, he was fluent in Latin, he was living in a time when political and religious turmoil were everywhere around him. He was not a Puritan. Puritans were gaining control in England. He was in the Anglican Church. And I think what he was doing was adding a cipher to his last name, a code, if you will, indicating what he was doing for Christ. The X is the Greek letter chi, which is a CKS sound in English, which is used as an indication for Christ. And I see William Blackstone putting that cipher in the middle of his name as a declaration of his position and what he was doing and why he was doing things. He was doing things for Christ. It's not something that's extremely uncommon. Christopher Columbus did the same thing with his name. He spelt it with an X at one point, and we still do it today with Xmas.
Some of Blackstone's early decisions represented not only his sense of survival, but also his ability to help recreate the England that he knew and loved. It is the development of the apple that represents that connection with the homeland and the wilds of Boston and Study Hill. Apples were also an important aspect of English life.
The apple is very English. You know how apples are associated with England and life back home. And for the first few years here, of course, they missed it entirely. There were no native apples except the native crab. And so one thing they wanted to do to make this more like home was to have apples. And it wasn't until about 1640 that they really start turning up in discussions and sales of orchards. I mean, obviously they'd been there before. But it's something they were looking forward to, and they were very happy when they got crops of apples here in New England. And the use of the apple in those days was as much for cider as it was for anything else. Preservation is, of course, key here. And in the early 17th century, we don't know of them drying apples much, but we do know of them making cider. One of the beverages, especially from people from West Country of England, and there were some of them here in Plymouth and elsewhere, would be very fond of, and they would have missed earlier. In the 17th century, fruit was a minor part of the diet compared to grain or meat. it was even a little suspect. It might be a little bit of a problem for you. But again, what is most important about apples is their use as a beverage, as cider, as being made into cider, and that was the way you preserve them.
Early maps of Boston have Blackstone's apple orchard clearly marked. Blackstone's industriousness is impressive, for starting an orchard from scratch is no easy task. Having spent 10 years in Boston, he was able to experiment with various varieties of apples and actually develop the first truly New England apple, the yellow sweeting. Governor Hopkins, in his 1765 History of Providence, wrote that the yellow sweeting was the sweetest apple ever tasted. When Blackstone up and left Boston for the wilds of Study Hill, he made sure he took with him plenty of seeds and cuttings. He would develop quite a large orchard in Rhode Island. The origin of the Rhode Island greening, a tart apple ideal for pies, while still somewhat of a mystery, can be attributed to either Reverend Blackstone or a former Newport, Rhode Island governor, William Brenton, on his Hammersmith farm. Either way, it is clear that Blackstone enjoyed the hands-on, labor-intensive art of developing different species of apples. Knowing his interest in science, it is quite conceivable that he kept a detailed record of the development of his orchards. Such pleasures as inspecting and strolling through his orchards would befit a man of God and nature. Blackstone died May 26, 1675, just 3 weeks before the eruption of the most significant Native American uprising here in New England, King Philip's War. And as interpreters, we've tried to put together a picture of just who was William Blackstone. So as you drive through the Blackstone Valley, you have a sense of who the founding father was. And yet, we really haven't even begun to explore his life. For example, his late-in-life marriage to the widow, Sarah Stevenson, his stepson, John, and his own son, John, born in 1660. What kind of a family man was Blackstone? What about his relationships with the Native Americans, the Narragansetts and the Nipmunks? Was he a friend and counselor, as some early writers suggest, or just another land-hungry Englishman, as some of the recent oral traditions from Narragansetts might also suggest? Questions, my friends, questions, and no easy answers. Well, this has been Ranger Chuck Arning with the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And one of the biggest tragedies we face as interpreters of history in discovering who Blackstone was is the loss of his huge personal library. He had over 185 volumes at his death, 10 of which were manuscripts written by himself. A man of his intellect, imagine what information they might hold. Scientific recordings of his development of the yellow sweeting apple. Perhaps meteorological records of his years at Study Hill. Records of his crops. Copies of his sermons. Perhaps even a journal of his thoughts and discoveries. Even correspondence with Roger Williams. But we'll never know for sure. Blackstone will suffer that cruel twist of historical fate. For his library, which could have made him a prominent figure in American history, was burned along with his house at the height of the King Philip's War. All his manuscripts gone. And all that leaves us Rangers with is our interpretive skills to help discover the story of who William Blackstone was. But a good story it is. So until next time, I hope to see you in the valley. Special thanks to all the National Park Service Rangers who use their interpretive skills every day to keep alive the stories that are our heritage.